All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. It's been a while since we've done some reading, but we're gonna get some reading done today. I'm gonna read the introduction to the Encyclopedia Logic, whole section of the preliminary notion of logic, first attitude of thought to objectivity, second attitude of thought to objectivity, and then the critical philosophy. We will definitely not finish today, but I will get through this, and I will record it all. So anyways, just going to get to reading. If anybody here has any questions or comments to make, just interrupt me wherever you feel like saying anything, and we'll see where that goes. So, preliminary notion, logic derived from a survey of the whole system. Logic is the science of the pure idea. Pure, that is, because the idea is in the abstract medium of thought. This definition, and the others which occur in these introductory outlines, are derived from a survey of the whole system, to which accordingly they are subsequent. The same remark applies to all prefatory notions, whatever about philosophy. So, he's saying that these distinctions he's making right here are distinctions from the end of the system. It's not distinctions that he's presupposing without justification. Right. He has justified it to himself, not to you yet. But it will come up. So, logic might have been defined as the science of thought and of its laws and characteristic forms. But thought, as thought, constitutes only the general medium, or qualifying circumstance, which renders the idea distinctively logical. If we identify the idea with thought, thought must not be taken in the sense of a method or form, but in the sense of the self-developing totality of its laws and peculiar terms. These laws are the work of thought itself, and not a fact which it finds and must submit to. So he's just kind of giving us some insight into what he means by thought. This is kind of preliminary outline of what it is, but don't hang on to that too much. From different points of view, logic is either the hardest or the easiest of the sciences. Logic is hard because it has to deal not with perceptions, nor, like geometry, with abstract representations of the senses, but with the pure abstractions, and because it demands a force and facility of withdrawing into pure thought, of keeping firm hold on it, and of moving in such an element. Logic is easy, because its facts are nothing but our own thought, and its familiar forms or terms. And these are the acme of simplicity, the ABC of everything else. They are also what we are best acquainted with, such as is and is not, quality and magnitude, being potential and being actual, one, many, and so on. But such an acquaintance only adds to the difficulties of the study. For while on the one hand we naturally think it is not worth our trouble to occupy ourselves any longer with things so familiar, on the other hand the problem is to become acquainted with them in a new way, quite opposite to that in which we know them already. Very straightforward. He has a remark on familiarity in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, where he mentions that a lot of these things people think that you don't need to think about or rather, they think that you don't need to think about them because they believe they already know them because they're familiar in the sense that they just intuitively use them. Nobody has to go and define these things for you when they teach them to you. Actually, you learn them through just use, and through use, you get good enough at using them that you just kind of get the general gist without ever actually having to make explicit what that gist actually is.
Yes.
So the utility of logic is a matter which concerns its bearings upon the student and the training it may give for other purposes. This logical training consists in the exercise in thinking which the student has to go through. This science is the thinking of thinking, and in the fact that he stores his head with thoughts in their native unalloyed character. unalloyed character. It is true that logic, being the absolute form of truth, and another name for the very truth itself, is something more than merely useful. Yet if what is noblest, most liberal, and most independent is also most useful, logic has some claim to the latter character. Its utility must then be estimated at another rate than exercise in thought for the sake of the exercise. Yep, indeed. Interestingly, Hegel also mentions stuff in other places where he says the exact opposite. Mentions how being what it is and being what philosophy is after, that this is an end in itself and it is basically useless for everything else. Not because it isn't useful. It necessarily actually is, because it's going to reveal the character of being itself, or what we generally assume being to be, in a common sense. But also because it's useless in the sense that it's an end in itself, that we don't do it for ulterior things. When you get into philosophy, when you start doing these kinds of things that you're going to do in the logic, there is no other purpose than to just, find out what it is. Later on, you find out that once you know what it is, it's useful for everything else. But before that, you don't know that, so you're just primarily interested in figuring it out.
Yes.
So, the first question is, what is the object of our science? The simplest and most intelligible answer to this question is that truth is the object of logic. Truth is a noble word, and the thing is nobler still. So long as man is sound at heart and in spirit, the search for truth must awake all the enthusiasm of his nature. But immediately there are steps in the objection. Are we able to know truth? There seems to be a disproportion between finite beings like ourselves and the truth which is absolute, and doubts suggest themselves whether there is any bridge between the finite and the infinite. God is truth. How shall we know him? Such an undertaking appears to stand in contradiction with the graces of lowliness and humility. Others who ask whether we can know the truth have a different purpose. They want to justify themselves in living on contented with their petty, finite aims, and humility is this stamp. Of this stamp is a poor thing. But the time is past when people asked, "How shall I, a poor worm of the dust, be able to know the truth?" And in its stead, we find vanity and conceit. People claim, without any trouble on their part, to breathe the very atmosphere of truth. The young have been flattered into the belief that they possess a natural birthright of moral and religious truth, and in the same strain, those of riper years are declared to be sunk, petrified, ossified in falsehood. Youth, say these teachers, sees the bright light of dawn, but the older generation lies in the slough, and a mire of the common day. They admit that the special sciences are something that certainly ought to be cultivated, but merely as the means to satisfy the needs of our outer life. In all this, it is not humility which holds back from the knowledge and study of the truth, but a conviction that we are already in the full possession of it. And no doubt the young carry with them the hopes of their elder peers. On them rests the advance of the world and science. But these hopes are set upon the young only on the condition that, instead of remaining as they are, they undertake the stern labor of mind. This modesty in truth-seeking has still another phase, and that is the genteel indifference to truth, as we see it in Pilate's conversation with Christ. Pilate asked, "What is truth?" with the air of a man who had settled accounts with everything long ago, and concluded that nothing particularly matters. He meant much the same as Solomon when he says, "All is vanity." When it comes to this, nothing is left but self-conceit. The knowledge of the truth meets an additional obstacle in timidity. A slothful mind finds it natural to say, "Don't let it be supposed that we mean to be in earnest with our philosophy. We shall be glad, inter alia, to study logic, but logic must be sure to leave us as we were before." People have a feeling that, if thinking passes the ordinary range of our ideas and impressions, it cannot but be on the evil road. They seem to be trusting themselves to a sea on which they will be tossed to and fro by the waves of thought. till at length they again reach the sandbank of this temporal scene, as utterly poor as when they left it. What comes of such a view we see in the world. It is possible within these limits to gain varied information and many accomplishments, to become a master of official routine, and to be trained for special purposes. But it is quite another thing to educate the spirit for the higher life, and to devote our energies to its service. In our own day, it may be hoped a longing for something better has sprung up among the young, so that they will not be contented with the mere straw of outer knowledge. So you can see people have been complaining about young people forever. 2. It is universally agreed that thought is the object of logic, but of thought our estimate may be very mean, or it may be very high. On one hand, people say, it is only a thought. In their view, thought is subjective, arbitrary, and accidental, distinguished from the thing itself, from the true and the real. On the other hand, a very high estimate may be formed of thought, when thought alone is held adequate to attain the highest of all things, the nature of God, of which the senses can tell us nothing. God is a spirit, it is said, and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. But the merely felt insensible, we admit, is not the spiritual. Its heart of hearts is in thought, and only spirit can know spirit. And though it is true that spirit can demean itself as feeling and sense, as is the case in religion, the mere feeling as a mode of consciousness is one thing, and its contents another. Feeling, as feeling, is the general form of the sensuous nature which we have in common with the brutes. This form, viz. Feeling, may possibly seize and appropriate the full organic truth, but the form has no real congruity with its contents. The form of feeling is the lowest in which spiritual truth can be expressed. The world of spiritual existences, God himself, exists in proper truth, only in thought and as thought. If this be so, therefore, thought, far from being a mere thought, is the highest, and in strict accuracy, the sole mode of apprehending the eternal and absolute.
Yes.
Yeah, so just alluded to the fact that in our own forms of language we have a completely, at least in the West, can't say anything about India and China and how they linguistically deal with this, but in the West we actually have distinctions of ideality, which one of them is, well, it's just a thought, it's just imaginary, it's nothing real. And then we say, it would be ideal, or, this or that is not ideal. But by the ideal, we mean the thing in its full perfection, its absolute, being. So that the ideal is somehow posited in a way that's more real than our empirical reality, which is the high sense of ideality. And it is funny that we have that double distinction, which is completely contradictory.
Explain to me the contradiction.
That in one sense, thought is treated as it is only a thought, that it's just a fiction, that it's not real. And in the other one, we're saying, a thing is ideal, or it would be ideal that such and such. And what we mean by that is if the thing was actually perfect. And we're saying, the idea is actually the perfection of the thing which exists empirically, so that the idea is more real, more the thing that it is than the actual thing that it exists in empirical reality.
One is real in the world of forms, and one is real in reality, and those are two different worlds to inhabit.
Sure, but one of those is perfect and the other one is not. And it's the ideal which is stated to be perfect when we say, when we speak of the ideal of this or that.
Yes, it's what we strive for. God is omniscient and omnipotent, and the ideal life form is omniscient and omnipotent.
Yes, stuff like that. Stuff about feeling. It's actually explained in many other places, particularly his philosophy of religion, also his lectures on the proofs of God. It's just about how, like, feeling, reducing the knowledge of God to the mere feeling, the feeling of faith, where faith is not actually just feeling. Is kind of demean God, because God is, at least in Christianity, God is a spirit. And then, what is the spirit? And at least in Hegel's sense, the spirit is mind, something mental, something immaterial. Doesn't have the limitations of materiality. Rather transcends materiality. Therefore, if you're going to know, if one really believes God is the absolute, to say that knowledge of God is limited to merely the feeling that one believes one knows God, is not good enough. That's animals can feel, but we don't think that animals know anything about God. So why do we accept that for human beings?
You give a rat enough neurons, I'm sure he'll figure out what God is.
I would disagree with you there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can definitely disagree with Hegel on that.
I think animals know God more than most of us.
No, I don't think so. Like, feeling is not knowledge in this case. It's not good enough.
Oh, okay. In that sense, yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah. For Hegel, like, feeling does not count as knowledge, because you can feel whatever, just because you feel it doesn't tell you what it is.
There is an idea in Jewish thought that animals, since they don't really have any knowledge, they intrinsically follow the will of the Creator.
Yeah. I mean, they can't err. Like, animals aren't good or evil. Like, they are exactly as they are created.
Although I would think according to Jewish thought, the sun and stars technically have more consciousness and intelligence than humans.
In esoteric things, that tends to be the case. They are higher beings.
They're larger. They're on a greater scale, but how are they more intelligent?
Because in esoteric views, they're considered to be like higher dimensional beings, so to say.
Kind of, yeah.
Like, they're celestial entities. They appear to us as mere bodies, but on their own level, they're not.
Yeah, the difference between form and spirit. The form of something and versus its essence.
Yeah. Anyways, I don't want to dwell too much on that. Just keep reading.
Yeah, keep going back. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So, as of thought, so also of the science of thought, a very high or a very low opinion may be formed. Any man, it is supposed, can think without logic, as he can digest without studying physiology. If he has studied logic, he thinks afterwards as he did before, perhaps more methodically, but with little alteration. If this were all, and if logic did no more than make men acquainted with the action of thought as the faculty of comparison and classification, it would produce nothing which had not been done quite as well before. And in point of fact, logic hitherto had no other idea of its duty than this. To be well informed about thought, even as a mere activity of the subject mind, is honorable and interesting for man. It is in knowing what he is and what he does that man is distinguished from the brutes. But we may take the higher estimate of thought, as what alone can get really in touch with the supreme and true. In that case, logic as the science of thought occupies a high ground. If the science of logic then considers thought in its action and its productions, and thought being no resultless energy produces thoughts and the particular thought required, the theme of logic is in general the supersensible world, and to deal with that theme is to dwell for a while in that world. Mathematics is concerned with the abstractions of time and space, but these are still the object of sense, although the sensible is abstract and idealized. Thought bids adieu even to this last and abstract sensible. It asserts its own native independence, renounces the field of the external and internal sense, and puts away the interest and inclinations of the individual. When logic takes this ground, it is a higher science than we are in the habit of supposing. So it's saying about, logic just teaching you about, how you're general faculty of thinking operates as far as, like methods of comparison and classification, and that just like adding nothing to anything we do. Historically, that was kind of the case, even though everybody just kind of, it was constantly said it teaches you how to think, insofar as, makes you formalize and pay attention to the things that you're saying more. You didn't need formal logic to actually clarify your thought. People were able to clarify their thoughts long before Aristotle formalized the rules of logic. So what was logic doing? Well, as far as like teaching you how to think, it really wasn't. Because insofar as the rules of logic are of any use and are of any, they're executed at all, they're executed upon some kind of prior thoughts, propositions or concepts, whichever you want, which are the real contents of thinking. The latter stuff of putting things in syllogisms and, paying attention what claims go with what and whether they contradict or not, whether they're coherent or not, doesn't change the fact that like the primary focus of cognition and of like actual commitments of action and belief concern the actual propositions and concepts themselves, not these external linkages we make between, this proposition, that proposition, or this concept and that concept. Which is why, Kant actually has something in the Critique of Pure Reason, I forget where he mentions about this whole thing, which he noticed himself. I mean, he was a philosophy teacher, he taught logic as well, in which he said, like, you can teach people how to, like, better organize their thoughts, but you can't actually teach them to think any better. You can't teach judgment. So, somebody starts with, like, stupid presuppositions, stupid beliefs. All that formal logic will do is back up and formalize and make valid a stupid set of beliefs and with a stupid set of conclusions. But logic cannot tell you whether those are good or not.
Shouldn't you be able to argue all the way down to the most fundamental beliefs? Like there shouldn't be any presuppositions that are unchangeable.
You can argue all the way down, but that's not really the function of logic. Logic will only tell you this is valid or invalid. The question is, like, what is the content that I'm actually talking about? And is that content, like, a good content, a bad content, valid, like, true, sound? But that's out of the purview of logical consideration. That's something to do with, like, your capacity to make, like, judgments about what those things actually are. So teaching somebody like formal logic is not really going to do anything for that. Which is, still a common problem since that's the dominant form of people's perceptions of thinking, including in philosophy. Where people think that just because you say something and you can make it coherent in a formal sense, that you've said something meaningful and, that needs to be respected at all. Like relativists, just because you can say something doesn't mean that what you're saying actually, like, makes sense. You put in you put it in P's and Q's and sure it looks fine, but, actually think about the content and it's a whole different matter. And then when you actually make arguments about such content, the clincher is not a formal argument. The clincher is like, it is a person following an actual train of thought imminent to what they're even saying. And if not, why not? And there's maybe a whole disentanglement of commitments and presuppositions and assumptions in that. But that's a whole different ballgame than logical formalism. Anyways, that's just the whole point of that.
I'm lacking the short-term memory right now. If I had the ability to communicate this idea well, I would, but I don't agree with the paragraphs you've been reading. I can't remember why, because my brain is not functioning well. But
yeah, that's fine. I mean, you have to, like, understand these are... It's an introduction, which he's already told us. He's making it from the end of his system. Yeah, so he's justified it to himself.
Ah,
He's telling us what comes out of
oh my
that,
God.
but
Ah,
it's not giving you an argument here. Like, as you can tell, like, he's not giving an argument like, oh, this is why you should think it's this way. He's just saying, look, here's
oh
how
my
I see it,
fucking God.
and so you can disagree because these are just prefatory remarks, which really tell you nothing other than like some little bits of expectations of what he believes, but it's giving you no argument that's any clincher for like why you should believe it. So I mean, it's perfectly fine that you disagree. As for let's see, so he says there can be a higher estimate of thought, as what alone can generally really touch what is supreme and true. In that case, logic as a science of thought occupies a high ground. Science of logic that considers thought in its action and its productions. The theme of logic is in general in the supersensible world. So he's taken a different view of thought as opposed to being a means that's indifferent to what it connects. He's taking logic to be its own ends here. That thought is its own independent thing. If thought is the one that accesses the absolute, then it takes one to know one, is the saying. So if thought accesses the absolute, thought in itself must be sharing some kind of absoluteness itself. So the necessity of understanding logic in a deeper sense, then as the science of the mere form of thought is enforced by the interest of religion and politics, of law and morality. In earlier days, men meant no harm by thinking. They thought away freely and fearlessly. They thought about God, about nature, and the state, and they felt sure that a knowledge of the truth was obtainable through thought only, and not through the senses or any random ideas or opinions. But while they so thought, the principal ordinances of life began to be seriously affected by their conclusions. Thought deprived existing institutions of their force. Constitution fell a victim to thought. Religion was assailed by thought. Firm religious beliefs which had been always looked upon as revelations were undermined, and in many minds the old faith was upset. The Greek philosophers, for example, became antagonists of the old religion and destroyed its beliefs. Philosophers were accordingly banished or put to death as revolutionists who had subverted religion and the state, two things which were inseparable. Thought, in short, made itself a power in the real world and exercised enormous influence. The matter ended by drawing attention to the influence of thought, and its claims were submitted to a more rigorous scrutiny, by which the world professed to find that thought arrogated too much and was unable to perform what it had undertaken. It had not, people said, learned the real being of God, of nature and mind. It had not learned what the truth was. What it had done was to overthrow religion and the state. What it had done was to overthrow religion and the state. It became urgent, therefore, to justify thought with reference to the results it had produced. And it is this examination to the nature of thought and this justification which in recent times has constituted one of the main problems of philosophy. Pretty anti-Marxist, anti-materialist point right there. Marx says, the philosophers had never done anything. Hegel says here the philosophers literally brought entire societies down. So let's see. Thought regarded as an activity. If we take our prima facie impression of thought, we find on examination first, that in its usual subjective acceptation, thought is one out of many activities of faculties of the mind, coordinate with such others as sensation, perception, imagination, desire, volition, and the like. The product of this activity, the form or character peculiar to thought, is the universal, or in general, the abstract. Thought, regarded as an activity, may be accordingly described as the active universal, and since the deed, its product, is the universal once more, may be called the self-actualizing universal. Thought conceived as a subject, agent, is a thinker, and the subject existing as a thinker is simply denoted by the term I. So, this is just a description of the at-face impression of thought. It's not his theory of thought yet.
Right.
So, the distinction between sense, conception, and thought. The propositions giving an account of thought in this and the following sections are not offered as assertions or opinions of mine on the matter, but in these preliminary chapters, any deduction or proof would be impossible, and the statements may be taken as matters of evidence. In other words, every man, when he thinks and considers his thoughts, will discover by the experience of his consciousness that they possess the character of universality, as well as the other aspects of thought to be afterwards enumerated. We assume, of course, that his powers of attention and abstraction have undergone a previous training, enabling him to observe correctly the evidence of his consciousness and his conceptions. This introductory exposition has already alluded to the distinction between sense, conception, and thought. As the distinction is of capital importance for understanding the nature and kinds of knowledge, it will help to explain matters if we here call attention to it. For the explanation of sense, the readiest method certainly is to refer to its external source, the organs of sense. But to name the organ does not help much to explain what is apprehended by it. The real distinction between sense and thought lies in this, that the essential feature of the sensible is individuality, and as the individual, which, reduced to its simplest terms, is the atom, is also a member of a group, sensible existence presents a number of mutually exclusive units. Of units, to speak in more definite and abstract formulae, which exist side by side with, and after, one another. Conception or picture thinking works with materials from the same sensuous source. But these materials, when conceived, are expressly characterized as in me and therefore mind, and secondly, as universal or simple because only referred to self. Nor is sense the only source of materialized conception. There are conceptions constituted by materials emanating from self-conscious thought, such as those of law, morality, religion, and even of thought itself, and it requires some effort to detect wherein lies the difference between such conceptions and thoughts having the same import. Let me read that real quick. But these materials, when conceived, the materials of sense, are expressly characterized as in me and therefore mine. They are in my consciousness. I think them. I experience them. And secondly, as universal or simple because only referred to self. They're abstract. That's why they're universal. Nor is sense the only source of materialized conception. There are conceptions constituted by materials emanating from self-consciousness thought, such as those of law, morality, religion, even of thought itself, and it requires some effort to detect wherein lies the difference between such conceptions and thoughts having the same import. We think stuff like the senses and objects and things like out there are objectively material in some sense. Which makes sense. It's kind of intuitive. It's pretty intuitive. Most people will assent to that. This is there are conceptions constituted by materials emanating from self-consciousness, such as those of law, and then law. Law here, I think, is most likely appealing to like legal law, as opposed to natural law. But even natural law falls under these things, and insofar as we think these things are intelligible, that they have some kind of determinateness, some specification, to that extent, they are material realities. We do act upon them. We order our lives based on them. To that extent, they have a material reality. But that material reality originates in thought and not in objects.
Yeah.
So let's see. Continuing forward. Go ahead.
Nothing.
All right. For it is a thought of which such conception is the vehicle, and there is no want of the form of universality without which no content could be in me or be a conception at all. Yet here also the peculiarity of conception is, generally speaking, to be sought in the individualism or isolation of its contents. True it is that, for example, law and legal provisions do not exist in a sensible space, mutually excluding one another, nor as regards time, though they appear to some extent in succession, are their contents themselves conceived as affected by time, or as transient and changeable in it. The fault in conception lies deeper. These ideas, though implicitly possessing the organic unity of mind, stand isolated here and there on the broad ground of conception, with its inward and abstract generality. Thus cut adrift, each is simple, unrelated. Right, duty, God. Conception in these circumstances either rests satisfied with declaring that right is right, God is God, or in a higher grade of culture it proceeds to enunciate the attributes, as for instance, God is the creator of the world, omniscient, almighty, etc. In this way, several isolated, simple predicates are strung together. But in spite of the link supplied by their subject, the predicates never get beyond mere contiguity. In this point, conception coincides with understanding. The only distinction between the latter introduces relations of universal and particular. The only distinction being that the latter introduces relations of universal and particular, that is the understanding, of cause and effect, etc., and in this way supplies a necessary connection to the isolated ideas of conception, which has left them side by side in its vague mental spaces, connected only by a bare and. So this is actually a good critique of just the way in which people think of objects and objectivity as such. People think that just because you say something and do exactly what Hegel says, just string a bunch of predicates which are not contradictory, that are coherent, that you have stated a valid object of cognition and of the world. But just because you say, there is some object, Klingsor, call it, that's the name, qualified by, that it's blue, it's square, it's four-dimensional, and so on, and you add as many predicates as you want that don't contradict, and then you say, there is an object of that, at least it is a possible object, because these things are not contradictory in themselves. And if I ever encounter a thing in the world which matches the description of what I have given, because it has all the attributes enumerated, then the object that I have spoken about was indeed a true object in the end. Except this makes no distinction between just things that merely appear to be objects, both in the conceptual sense and in the real sense. People don't consider that you can have mirages, so to say, of the mind, just as you can have mirages of the physical. Just because a thing looks like an object doesn't make it an object, and just because a thing looks like a thought doesn't make it a thought.
Well, what's an example of something that looks like a thought isn't?
So in this case, saying, God is good, the creator of the world, omniscient, almighty, etc.
Right.
You're enumerating various concepts. You just put, God is a creator, and omniscient, and almighty, and so long as you don't contradict anything prior in the whole construction, it's taken to be that, it must be a real object. I have stated something that is an object because I say so. Because the quality of an object is merely that it's not a collection that is contradictory as a collection or between its elements. But that's not really a good concept of objectivity. That's just merely stipulated. Just because you stipulate it doesn't mean that it's actually anything at all.
Something through direct observation. What do you know?
Not in this case, like even observation. Actually, it'll come up later in the attitudes to objectivity. He'll mention that this whole thing about empiricism and rationalism both don't work. It's not a mere. You can't just merely observe these things empirically, and you also cannot merely stipulate them as transcendental conditions rationally. There has to be an actual proof procedure for what makes a valid thought an actual valid thought. And that proof procedure is going to be a self-generation of an object, so that when you have an actual object, when you have an actual thought, that thought must be an operative thought of some kind. So that it's not going to merely be a collection of attributes or predicates, qualities. It's going to be something in which, X is, a seed. And the moment you know something is a seed is that which grows into a plant. Therefore, from the very thought of what you're given, there's now a movement of one consequence to another consequence to another consequence. By the nature of the concept itself, that this results from thinking through what that actually is, rather than like you having to go and mechanically and subjectively append predicates. Rather, the thing grows its own predicates out of itself, so to say. So on this server, we have that question when you join on the vetting channel about, question 4, given a 2D plane, what is the minimal number of straight lines that fully enclose a space within the plane? Could there be more than one answer? What that question is supposed to test is somebody's ability to think consequentially from within a thought. That's what it's for. So you understand you have a 2D plane. Well, a plane is 2D, but I don't want people to mistake it might be a plane in 3D or whatever. And you're told within that plane, fully enclose a space with straight lines. Given that construction and given that end, there's only one consequent connection that allows that to happen, and that is 3 lines, intersecting each other to create a triangle. That's what happens. Just as, if you understand what a seed is, you know that a seed has to grow into some kind of plant or whatever. And so therefore, when you say, God is whatever, X, whatever X that may be, it better be something that actually has a generative character to it. Otherwise, you don't really have a thought at all. You're just stringing concepts together. And then, because you decide that these concepts are collected and, should be collected based on what? Nobody knows. And then you give it a name and you say, this is now a category of an object. Well, no, it's not.
Well, it's a possible object, right? Not.
Yeah. In this case, it would not even count as a possible object. Just saying, look,
Oh, it's just to collect property.
Because think about it. What is an object in everyday terms? What do people actually intend by that? Well, they mean something like that's independent of my consciousness and independent to some extent from other things.
Right.
Well, in the case of, saying, for example, God, something has a quality of being the creator of the world, also has a quality of omniscience, almighty, beyond physicality, immaterial, blah, blah, blah. From each category, how do I go from creator of the world? What does it have to do with omniscience? What does it have to do with omnipotence? What does it have to do with immateriality? Immediately nothing. How do I go from the thought of the creator of the world to the rest of these? How do I go from the thought of the omniscient to the rest of these, or the almighty to the rest of these? How do these things organically actually grow out of each other and prove on their own that objectively they mean this interrelated connection of concepts, rather than being my subjective stringing together of this and that, and then putting it together and just saying, well, here's a category, I call it God. Because this way of thought actually causes much of the confusion in philosophy and in debate discourse, where people think that the matter of an object is merely like the enunciation of it, the matter that I say it, and then we can debate between well, which is the true God and which is why don't you believe in that God, and what if God is a chair in the 23rd dimension or whatever. People think that they can just apply these names willy-nilly and that it means something. Whereas, for example, if you start with just the simple case, God is the absolute, what does that mean? It means something that's on the linguistic level, etymologically, the absolute is that which does not dissolve into something else. Therefore, we'll have no other distinctions beyond it, which it will transfer to in some kind of cognitive operation or in a real instance of any kind. Well, then that gives you something consequent to think about, what consequences does this have? What does this cascade to as a function of meaning? I can't do that if I just string things together, but I can do that if I have one fundamental generative aspect from which something will follow. And then in that, what follows, now we can actually be objective, because now there's a specific thing, just like the question of the triangle. I'm being given a specific condition. Now, what is actionable based on that condition? That is what a real thought is.
Any thought to that?
All right, so the difference between conception and thought is of special individuality and mutual exclusion of the members. It is well to remember that these very attributes of sense are thoughts and general terms. It will be shown in the logic that thought and the universal is not a mere opposite of sense. It lets nothing escape it, but outflanking its other is at once the other and itself. Now, language is the work of thought, and hence all that is expressed in language must be universal. What I only mean or suppose is mine. It belongs to me, this particular individual. But language expresses nothing but universality, and so I cannot say what I merely mean. And the unutterable, feeling or sensation, far from being the highest truth, is the most unimportant and untrue. If I say the individual, this individual, here, now, all these are universal terms. Everything and anything is an individual, a this, and if it is to be sensible, is here and now. Similarly, when I say I mean my single self to the exclusion of all others, but what I say vis I is just every I, which in like manner excludes all others from itself. In an awkward expression which Kant used, he said that I accompany all my conceptions, sensations too, desires, actions, etc. I is in essence and act the universal, and such partnership is a form, though an external form, of universality. All other men have it in common with me to be I, just as it is common to all my sensations and conceptions to be mine. But I, in the abstract, as such, is the mere act of self-concentration or self-relation, in which we make abstraction from all conception and feeling, from every state of mind and every peculiarity of nature, talent and experience. To this extent, I is the existence of a wholly abstract universality, a principle of abstract freedom. Hence thought, viewed as subject, is what is expressed by the word I, and since I am at the same time in all my sensations, conceptions, and states of consciousness, thought is everywhere present and is a category that runs through all these modifications. Okay, very interesting paragraph. So the thing about language, he says language is the work of thought, hence all that is expressed in language must be universal. Not only can these be shown in just like the structure of thought, the form of thought literally cannot specify sense individuality. What it specifies is categories. And all individuality that's specified in language is an individuality within language itself through relationships of universal. So it's an universal individuality. So it says, what I only mean or suppose is mine. And here I think the emphasis, even though it's not in the written text here, I think the emphasis is on what I only mean or suppose is mine. It belongs to me, this particular individual. But language expresses nothing but universality, and so I cannot say what I merely mean. And the unutterable feeling or sensation. All right, so that what I only mean or suppose is mine. That would be taking the assumption that, what I mean is radically individual to me. It belongs to me. So this particular individual says, but language expresses nothing but universality, and so I cannot say what I merely mean. So, I have a can of White Claw, hard seltzer, blackberry flavored alcoholic beverage in front of me. But when I tell you that, in me telling you that, does not present to you the actual thing, the individuality of the sense thing right here before me. What I communicate to you and what it appears to you is a universal meaning. You know what a can is, you know what a alcoholic beverage is, and all these other things. And so you have a category, and then you can make in your mind your own representation of what I'm talking about. But you're not experiencing the actual thing that I mean. I could only circumstantially express it. So let's see. There's also something there you can take. So language expresses nothing but universality, and so I cannot say what I merely mean. There's something that Wittgenstein has against private language, in which language is by its very nature a social activity, which means it's universal. Universal here, take it just to be unity. Anything that's a unity is a universal. So if the purpose of language is to express what is radically mine, what is radically individual, language itself already refutes or contradicts that very purpose, because language is a universal procedure by its very nature already. The act of communication is co-communication. It's already a universal activity. It's not actually radically singular at all. See, and the unutterable feeling or sensation, far from being the highest truth, is the most unimportant and untrue. Here, in the sense that all the things that are worth communicating, essentially, the primary purpose of communication is a universal concern. It's not actually the radically individual, immediate, sensuous concern. So if I say the individual, this individual, here, now, all these are universal terms. Exactly, they're just categories. At best, they are indexicals. They point to something else that's supposed to be sensuously present to you, but as mere words without us having the actual sensuous object before me or before you to point at to each other. The language itself does not express the actual object we mean. So everything and anything is an individual of this, and if it is to be sensible, is here and now. Similarly, when I say I mean my single self to the exclusion of all others, but what I say, viz. I, is just every I, which in like manner excludes all others from itself. I say I am, and what I intend is to point to the radical individuality of experience and existence that I am, but my language only speaks the I, whose I, my I, but whose I is that? Every I is my I, insofar as every I to itself is its own. So, without a much more torturous elaboration, you're actually speaking only about the universal I, rather than some kind of individual I. In an awkward expression which Kant used, he said that I accompany all my conceptions, sensations too, desires, actions, etc. I is in essence an act of the universal, and such partnership is a form, though an external form, of universality. This is an interesting one. I is an essence and act of the universal. The I, rather than being like this radical atomic individuality, is actually the overarching universality of experience itself. Kant calls it the transcendental unity of apperception. That insofar as there's any unity at all, it is a unity in me. And if there is no unity in me, there will be no unity in the world present to me. There won't be a me to be present or had to have anything present to it at all. Therefore, all unity is my unity. Which leads a certain scholar that there's a set of lectures, I forget who it is, who mentions that his conclusion from this peculiar structure of the I is that for Kant, thought and the I have to be the exact same thing. Like thought itself is the I, and the I is thought itself.
Do emotions constitute?
You broke up there.
Do emotions not also constitute the I?
Constitute it, yes.
Thoughts, though, are an inherent part of the I, you're saying.
Yeah, the empirical I. And they would actually be qualified as thought determinations.
Determine. What's the difference between thought and a determination? There's not.
Essentially none. A determination is a thought. To say thought determinations is basically kind of like, it is kind of redundant. Because thought, the reason like thought is brought into the picture is thought is the unity. So if the I is thought, unity is thought itself. Thought is pure universality. The I is itself pure universality. All things, including the abstraction of thought itself, is within the I. The I is the unity both of the thought and all of the non-thoughts. And it does so through its own comprehension of itself in thought. And insofar as the I beholds itself, it is itself a product of thought within its own thinking. He says, but I in the abstract as such is the mere act of self-concentration or self-relation, in which we make abstraction from all conception and feeling, from every state of mind, and every peculiarity of nature, talent, and experience. This part, I in the abstract as such, is the mere act of self-concentration and of self-relation. Well, guess what? Self relates. Anything that is an object, if you look at a physical object, in order for a thing to appear as a physical object, it has to have a fully apparent bound of some kind. If the thing does not actually come back upon itself in some manner, in some quality or whatever, it just does not appear as an other to anything at all. Without a boundary, there is no otherness. Everything just kind of melts together into one goop, so to say.
Nothing and everything at
the
same time.
Yeah. And so if a thing does not self-relate, if it does not self-enclose in some way, it's not really a thing. There's nothing there. So, the I does this necessarily in the form of self-consciousness, but the pure I in the metaphysical sense is just the subject, and everything that is an object at all of any kind has to have some kind of self-relating subjectivity.
Right. Can you have multiple layers of self-relation?
Yes.
Yeah,
you can have things that are more or less subject, more or less object.
Yes.
So I in the abstract, in which we are abstraction from false conception, feeling, blah, blah. To this extent, I is the existence of a wholly abstract universality, a principle of abstract freedom. That's the I where, I say I am. What I'm doing there is I'm extracting myself from all relationship, making myself into a pure abstraction of thought, the pure I, and I say I am. And since I am at the same time in all my sensations, conceptions, and states of consciousness, thought is everywhere present and is a category that runs through all these modifications. There you go. You asked earlier about the emotion things. So, whatever emotions are, since they are not only in me, but I exist in and through them as parts of myself, and I am pure thought. Therefore, thought in some way determines and constitutes the being of these things within me. Let's see, how long have we gone? Wow, we've been going for an hour. Well, we'll do one more section, section 20, because then another subsection begins afterwards, which is a fine place to stop. Section 20. Our first impression when we use the term thought is of a subjective activity, one among many similar faculties, such as memory, imagination, and will. Were thought merely an activity of the subject mind and treated under that aspect by logic, logic would resemble the other sciences in possessing a well-marked object. It might in that case seem arbitrary to devote a special science to thought, while will, imagination, and the rest were denied the same privilege. The selection of one faculty, however, might even in this view be very well grounded on a certain authority acknowledged to belong to thought, and on its claim to be regarded as the true nature of man, in which consists his distinction from the brutes. Nor is it unimportant to study thought even as a subjective energy. A detailed analysis of its nature would exhibit rules and laws, a knowledge of which is derived from experience. A treatment of the laws of thought, from this point of view, used once to form the body of logical science. Of that science, Aristotle was the founder. He succeeded in assigning to thought what properly belongs to it. Our thought is extremely concrete, but in its composite contents, we must distinguish the part that properly belongs to thought or to the abstract mode of its action. A subtle spiritual bond consisting in the agency of thought is what gives unity to all these contents, and it was this bond, the form as form, that Aristotle noted and described. Up to the present day, the logic of Aristotle continues to be the received system. It has indeed been spun out to greater length, especially by the labors of the medieval schoolmen who, without making any material additions, merely refined in details. The moderns also have left their mark upon this logic, partly by omitting many points of logical doctrine due to Aristotle and the schoolmen, and partly by foisting in a quantity of psychological matter. The purport of the science is to become acquainted with the procedure of finite thought, and if it is adapted to its presupposed object, the science is entitled to be styled correct. The study of this formal logic undoubtedly has its uses. It sharpens the wits, as the phrase goes, and teaches us to collect our thoughts and to abstract. Whereas in common consciousness, we have to deal with sensuous conceptions which cross and perplex one another. Abstraction, moreover, implies the concentration of the mind on a single point, and thus induces the habit of attending to our inward selves. An acquaintance with the forms of finite thought may be made a means of training the mind for the empirical sciences, since their method is regulated by these forms, and in this sense, logic has been designated instrumental. It is true, we may be still more liberal and say, logic is to be studied not for its utility, but for its own sake. The super-excellent is not to be sought for the sake of mere utility. In one sense, this is quite correct, but it may be replied that the super-excellent is also the most useful, because it is the all-sustaining principle which, having a subsistence of its own, may therefore serve as the vehicle of special ends which it furthers and secures. And thus, special ends, though they have no right to be set at first, are still fostered by the presence of the highest good. Religion, for instance, has an absolute value of its own, yet at the same time other ends flourish and succeed in its train. As Christ says, Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Particular ends can be attained only in the attainment of what absolutely is and exists in its own right. So basically, it's an argument from contingency. Everything else is contingent upon logic, therefore, logic is necessary, and since it's required for everything else, can't get more useful than the thing that makes everything else possible.
Yes.
Okay, so it's been about an hour. We'll leave it on that. We're on section 21. We will see when we continue it. For those of you listening, hope you found it useful. See you around.